All right, everybody. Welcome to the Bald Eagle podcast. I am Shawn Cressman. I am the Bald Eagle. Okay, so I always start my podcast off with a couple of rules just so everybody knows, what to expect. My rules, and they're pretty. I stick to them solidly because I think it's, I don't know, it's important to I think to have some consistency. So rule number one: no politics. We'll never talk about them, no matter what happens. The only exception would be if those politics bleed into if they affect the game. Haven't yet. We talked about some um, uh, limiting limited capacity or no fans and stands is about as extensive as we got as far as politics are concerned. So, rule number one, most important rule. So hopefully you guys are comfortable and find this as again. I always say this as an escape from all of that. No matter what side you're on, in the middle, whatever, you can come here and not worry about it. I also don't really spend any time talking about the players' personal lives. I usually share the fact that Fox and that's traditionally the pregame show I watch is Fox. So um, I generally watch that, and often they'll sit a player down and talk about that person's personal life, and it doesn't really interest me. So you won't have to hear any about that stuff. And lastly, I'm not censored. All right, now this is traditionally 100% Philadelphia Eagle podcast, the Bald Eagle podcast. That's me. However, we're currently in the middle of the playoffs, about to be in the Super Bowl. So I don't want to just completely ignore the NFL. I love the NFL too. So this is the Bald Eagle podcast playoff edition. So we're going to talk about the teams in the playoffs as well. Now we just ended championship weekend. So our countdown is to Super Bowl 55. That is Sunday, February 7th, 6:30 p.m. on CBS, 11 days from now. So we have that countdown, and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers will be the first team to ever play at home, and then we'll face the Kansas City Chiefs. We're not going to go over the Super Bowl just for you guys, so we're not going to really do a preview on the Super Bowl on this episode. I figured I'd save that and do a little bit more comprehensive review on the next episode, because other than that, there's not much else to talk about. With the Pro Bowl being, I didn't look into it, but to my knowledge, the Pro Bowl is a video game, so. I usually watch it, but I don't know if I will. We'll see. We'll see what happens. So, all right, let's get into some games over the weekend. The first game I'm going to go over is the 5th seed Tampa Bay Buccaneers against the 1st seed Green Bay Packers. And we all know the Bucs won 31-26, or hopefully you already knew. And it was, in my opinion, I went into this game thinking that Rodgers would be able to overcome the Tom Brady and the Bucs defense. He was able to overcome Tom Brady by all means, and more so in the second half than the first. But the Bucs defense was just too much for him. He wasn't able to go up against the Bucs defense. They had some really good opportunities, 3 turnovers, and were only able to get 6 points out of them. So that's where the Bucs defense came in. One of the things that I looked at. So if you look at the game, with less than a minute in the second half. The score was at the time. The score was 21-10 in favor of the Bucs. Tampa Bay gets the ball because of a Green Bay fumble. They get it on Green Bay's 8-yard line, and easily Tom Brady throws an 8-yard touchdown pass to Cameron Brate. I think that there was 13 minutes and 58 seconds left in the third quarter. So basically the whole second half. At that point, after that completion, Brady was 14 for 23. Which is 60.9% completion rate, which is about average. That's nothing remarkable. 210 yards, but he threw 3 touchdowns, no interceptions. And at that point, his rating would have been 130.43, which is only 30 points shy of perfect. 158, I think 0.3 is a perfect quarterback rating. So he had an excellent first play of the second half. From that point on, he did horribly. Probably one of the lowest rated. Now, I haven't done all the splits on every quarterback's half and all that stuff, but I can't imagine that any other quarterbacks, especially ones that were in the playoffs, had a worse rating in a half. He, from the point at which he threw that touchdown with 13 minutes and 58 seconds left in the third quarter, he went 6 for 13, which is a 46.2 completion percentage, which is very poor. He threw that, and those 6 completions were for 70 yards. So he didn't even break 100 yards in the second half. He had 0 touchdowns and 3 interceptions. So that added up to a quarterback rating of 23.4. I see that we're having some technical difficulties here. My camera is flashing. I apologize for that. So played horribly, essentially the majority of the second half. And that's what I say that Aaron Rodgers outplayed Brady. We'll go over his stats later. But more importantly, Brady had an awful game, but was still able to hang on and win, hang on to that lead. And I think that was mostly in part by from his defense. So now once you add those stats together, he ended the game. Tom Brady ended the game 20 for 36, which is about 55.6% completion percentage. He threw for 280 yards, 3 touchdowns, 3 picks, which gives you a quarterback rating of 73.8. He was sacked once for 5-yard loss, so nothing significant, but still not a very good game for a playoff game, and really gave the Packers an opportunity to win in the second half. Even though he played a poor game, he is now 2-0. In conference championship games in which he threw 3 or more interceptions. So even though he had a poor second half, he is 2-0 in conference games where he throws 3 or more picks. If you combine the stats for all other quarterbacks in championships games who threw 3 or more interceptions, they're 7-23. So generally speaking, it's not a good thing to throw 3 picks in a conference game unless you're Tom Brady. This was also his 8th playoff game with a quarterback rating less than 75. Now, arguably, he may have more games with a quarterback rating less than 75 because he has played by far more playoff games than any other player in NFL history, especially quarterback. The next quarterback, however, has 4 playoff wins with a quarterback rating of 75 or less. So, and he also tied Joe Flacco, of all people, with his 7th road playoff win, which is tied for the most in NFL history. So some interesting stats to go along with his game. Tampa Bay also ran the ball a little bit, not a ton. Fournette was their leading rusher. He had 12 rushes for 55 yards, which is about a 4.6 yard average. And he did have 1 touchdown. Godwin had 5 receptions on 9 targets for 110 yards, which is a 22 yard average. I mentioned before, Tampa Bay's defense was the key to this win. And we always talk about one of the things, anyway, that announcers or most analysts will bring up when talking about defense and the success of defense would be their time on the field. When the offense gets off the field quickly, whether it's good or bad, that requires the defense to do more work. And as a defense, it's easier to get worn down. They were in the, Tampa Bay's defense was on the field for over 57% of the game, which doesn't sound like a significant amount, but it was over 61% of the second half, which was 18 minutes out of 30, more than 18 minutes and 21 seconds. So that means that the second half, the Tampa Bay Bucks offense only had the ball for less than 12 minutes. So that's a pretty heavy duty to ask the defense to stay on the field for that long, and they were able to do it. They were also able to get to Rodgers 5 times, which ties a franchise Tampa Bay Buccaneer record for most sacks in a playoff game. So they were able to get to Rodgers and consistently. He had, I think they had 2 sacks in the first half and 3 in the second half. So they were getting to him often and on consistent. So they did a good job, and I credit the win to the defense. Now, I mentioned earlier, Tampa Bay will be the first time a team has played the Super Bowl at their home stadium. This is Super Bowl 55, so it goes back 55 years. Admittedly, did not do the research for the championships prior to the Super Bowl, because really most people don't. Eagles fans care about NFL championships before the Super Bowl because we had a few, but generally most people don't really talk about that. They talk about the Super Bowl era. And lastly, and we'll talk about this a little more detail. This is the second time that a state has had had finalists in all 4 of the major sports leagues. So the top 4 are considered the NFL, the NBA, NHL hockey, and Major League Baseball. So they are the second state in history to have finalists in all 4 of those leagues. The first state to do that was Pennsylvania. And we did that back in 1980. And we'll talk a little bit about that more with our Eagles fact. I'll give you a little teaser. So talking about going back to the Packers Bucks game, Rodgers did take a little bit of time to get going. He wasn't real. He didn't. Tampa Bay went up very quickly, and he did have to come back from a deficit. And there was an odd play that most of you have probably heard of and talked about often is, with a little more than 2 minutes left in the game, they chose to kick a field goal on third down instead of going for a touchdown. And that ultimately was the end of the game because I don't believe they got the ball back, I believe with an onside kick, but weren't able to score a touchdown. Anyway, they I don't believe they got the ball back afterward. But regardless, 3 points when you needed 8 was more than 8 was, I don't think, was a very good idea. And to expect to be able to get the ball back and drive down the field for a touchdown to win the game, I think was unrealistic as well. So I'm not sure why they kicked the field goal and didn't go for it, but an opportunity to make things a little closer. And in my opinion, perhaps not every quarterback in the league would you give them the ball on fourth down and with the game on the line. I mean, realistically, every team should want their quarterback to be in that position. But out of all the ones in the NFL, Aaron Rodgers would be top of my list of ones that I would trust with that ball and that opportunity. So, but that's just me. So Rodgers did have a great game overall. He ended 33 for 48, which means he completed 68.8% of his passes, which is pretty good. He had 346 yards. He had 3 touchdowns, but he did have 1 pick. Quarterback rating was 101.6, which is good. He did get sacked 5 times, I mentioned, and he did lose 32 yards with those sacks. So Aaron Rodgers became the first quarterback in NFL history to lose 4 straight conference championship games. And his defenses were probably the reason why. He had excellent stats and they scored plenty of points. But his defense is probably the reason why he hasn't had more success in the playoffs. Since 1950, his defenses have allowed more points per game than any other starting quarterback in the playoffs. They average about 20. The defense allows, on average, 26.6 games per playoff game, which is the most since 1950. So he's got a lot to overcome. And perhaps if Green Bay focuses more on defense, or if they had, he would have had, perhaps he would have won 1 or 2 of those other conference championship games. The Packers' leading rusher was Jones. He had 6 rushes for 27 yards as a 4.5 average. The receiver that had the most receptions was Adams. He had 9 receptions on 15 targets for 67 yards, and that was a 7.4 average. And he had a touchdown. But Valdez-Scantling led in receiving yards. He had 4 receptions on 6 targets for 115 yards, which is a 28.8 average and 1 touchdown. So close game. The Packers almost came back to win it, but ultimately lost to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So Tom Brady essentially, and there's memes going around saying just as much, essentially picked a team and said, hey, you guys want to go to the Super Bowl? And he took them to the Super Bowl. So very interesting. It's going to be a very interesting game, Tom Brady and Mahomes. And I didn't think they'd beat the Packers, but I feel more strongly that they'll lose to the Chiefs. But we'll see what happens. So the next the AFC Championship game is the next one we're going to go over. Buffalo, number 2 seed Buffalo at number 1 Kansas City. And this one probably went about the way that we all expected it to. There was a potential, I think, Buffalo had to keep up with Kansas City. They do have an offense that's been scoring points, has been able to score points. The problem is that they essentially lean, or at least they have more often anyway in the playoffs, almost solely on Josh Allen. He represents a majority of their offense, and traditionally quarterbacks do, because you throw for more passing yards than you run in general. However, Josh Allen, I think in 2 or 3 of his playoff games was not only, of course, the leading passer, but also the leading rusher. So when I say that he's a higher percent of his offense, you might think to yourself, well, Lamar Jackson, I'm sure, is a significant percentage of his own offense. But actually, and I didn't go through and look at every quarterback because that would have required me to tally up all those yards for all those teams, and I didn't get a chance. But besides the Ravens, I can't think of another team where their leading rusher is their quarterback or close to it. If anybody has an idea, let me know, and we can talk about it. But the point I'm trying to make is that the Bills have, especially in the playoffs, solely relied on Josh Allen for all of their offensive production. which isn't necessarily the smartest idea, especially if you're if you're expecting to win often. Because let's be honest, defenses in the NFL are smart enough to know that Josh Allen was the primary driver of their offensive yards, and all they had to do was stop him. And that's essentially what they did. And you know, another. So I thought that the Bills could keep up with the Chiefs, possibly. In addition, it seemed like a good winning strategy anyway would be to try and get as many points as early as possible. I mean, let's be honest. When you force the Chiefs to pass, you're not really reducing their efficiency. They're an excellent. I think they're one of the top passing teams in the league. And then again, if they have the lead and they can control the ball, they can also run well enough to run it down. So I think the best strategy for anybody to implement against the Chiefs is to run it up real quick as fast as possible, similar to what the Browns did to the Steelers, and just kind of hang on and hope that you can slow them down enough and not let them have enough time to come back. And they started to do that. Surprisingly, the Bills were up 9-0 in the first quarter, but they just weren't able to hold on to that lead or even recover the lead after it was lost. So I mentioned that Josh Allen was a majority of the Bills' offense. So during regular season, he was 78.3% of their total offensive yards. And I even backed out sack yards because I thought that was fair. So this is net passing yards minus sack yards lost with sacks and rushing yards. So he added up to about 78.3%. If I remember correctly, and I should have written it down, Lamar Jackson was in the high 60s. As a regular season as a part of his offense, because he had, in addition to himself as the leading rusher, he had another rusher that Ingram, I think, had 1,000 yards. Now, I mentioned that got worse in the playoffs. So on average, 78.3. Well, through the whole season, 78.3% of his offense, of Buffalo's offense, was Josh Allen. Moved to the Colts game, the Colts playoff game that they won. He represented 89.4% of their offensive yards. To the Rams game the game that they beat the Ravens, 86.8% of their offense. And then against Kansas City, they didn't have a lot of offensive yards, not nearly as many as some of the previous games, but he was still 88.7% of their total offensive yards. And again, he's good. He's very good. And in past playoff games had played excellently. But if you're a defensive coordinator and you see these numbers, it's pretty clear what your plan should be. And it's pretty relatively easy to execute on a plan when it's so singular, when it's one thing. So he did okay, but didn't have a great game. He ended 28 for 48, which is 58.3% of his passes, 287 yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception, and an 80.8 quarterback rating. Not horrible, significantly worse than his first few games. His completion percentage was lower than average, and his rating. He doesn't often throw interceptions either. So, and then he did get sacked 4 times and lost 53 yards with those sacks. One of which we probably remember was the one where he ran around a while and probably lost 30 yards on that one sack. So, so the fact that he is mobile and tries to avoid pressure sometimes hurts them, and it was significant, almost over 50 yards that they lost because of it. Again, he was their leading rusher. He had 7 rushes for 88 yards. That was a 12.6 average. So again, pretty one-dimensional on offense. Allen was their leading rusher. Josh Allen was their leading rusher. Outside of that, Singletary had 6 rushes for 17 yards, so essentially nothing. That's a 2.8 average, which is poor. Beasley was their leading receiver. He had 7 receptions on 9 targets for 88 yards, and that's a 12.6 average. So they didn't even have a 100-yard receiver. So not a good offensive showing, which is what they needed to try and keep up with the Kansas City Chiefs, who dominated on offense, which is unsurprising to most of the people out there that watch the NFL. They only had to punt once throughout the whole game. In the red zone, they were 5 for 6, which is 83%. Goal to go. So when they're first, second, third, or fourth down and goal, they were 5 for 5, 100%. Even though they ran 6 fewer plays in the Bills, they led in total yards, passing yards, and first downs. So what that tells you is that they were clearly more efficient. If they were able to achieve more yards total and more first downs in 6 fewer plays. They obviously were getting more yards per play and more efficient. Mahomes, excellent game. He was 29 for 38, which is a 76.3% completion rate. Excellent. Anything over 70 is remarkable. He had 325 yards, threw 3 touchdowns, didn't have a pick, and he had a 127.6 quarterback rating. He was sacked 1 time, but he didn't lose any yards. So excellent game by Mahomes per usual. Kansas City's leading rusher was Darrell Williams. He had 13 carries for 52 yards, as a 4-point average, and 1 touchdown. And then they had 2 100-yard receivers. I'm sure you can guess their names: Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelce. However, Hill had the most yards, but Kelce had more receptions. So Tyreek Hill had 9 receptions on 11 targets for 172 yards, which is a 19.1 average. And then Travis Kelce had 13 receptions on 15 targets for 118 yards, 9.1 average, and 2 touchdowns. So it would be remarkable to have either one of those stats on any of the receivers on the Philadelphia Eagles. It would be amazing. And if you add up Hill and Kelce's receiving yards, it actually is more than Allen had passing. So just kind of gives you an idea of how well Kansas City did on offense. So I mentioned earlier, I'm not going to talk real much in depth anyway about Super Bowl 55. It is Kansas City at Tampa Bay. Going to be interesting. Next week, Wednesday at 6, I'm always on, and I will do an in-depth preview of the Super Bowl. So we'll talk a lot more about it next week. So let's talk about some Eagles news, right? Let's get to what I really want to. I mean, I love the NFL and I love the playoffs, but I'd really like to talk about the Eagles and the changes they've been making, because they've been pretty significant. So of course we should all know that we hired a new head coach in Nick Sirianni. But we've also hired a bunch of coordinators as well, and lost a couple of people. When I say lost, I'm not going to go over the people that were let go or contracts weren't renewed. For example, Press Taylor, our quarterback coach / pass game coordinator, will not be returning. I wouldn't have normally brought that up because he deserves to not return. So I'm not going to go over all the firings, but I'll go over the people that perhaps we didn't want to lose and we did, and some rumors about people that might be that are staying. So of course we got Nick Sirianni, our head coach. We also, and some of these are rumors. I don't know that all of it's official, but to my knowledge, they're strong enough rumors that odds are they will be official. So as we replace our defensive coordinator, good riddance to Jim Schwartz. Never been a fan. We replaced him with a gentleman by the name of Jonathan Gannon. He started coaching in 2003. Coached both in the NFL and college. He spent most of his time coaching defensive backs. He worked with Sirianni in Indianapolis the last 2 years, 2018 to 2023. He will likely run a 4-3 defense, which lines up really well with our current personnel. And he was very popular as a potential coach. When there were rumors that Josh McDaniels was going to be hired as the head coach, and there were also rumors that Josh McDaniels felt so strongly about that he was starting to assemble a crew. Jonathan Gannon was rumored to be part of that staff had the Eagles hired Josh McDaniels. But he also interviewed with other teams for the same position, defensive coordinator. So we added a defensive line coach, Tracy Rocker. He was actually selected in the 3rd round of the 1989 NFL draft. Didn't spend a lot of time in the NFL because he started his coaching career in 1992. So only 3 years later, 3 years after he got drafted. Almost all his experience has been in college. And he did work with Jonathan Gannon, our new defensive coordinator, from 2012 to 2013 with the Tennessee Titans. The last 2 years, the last 2 seasons he spent at South Carolina, but briefly joined Auburn, I guess, before accepting the Eagles job. So I don't know if he joined Auburn in the offseason and then didn't get a chance to start yet, and then jumped to the Eagles. But so Tracy Rocker, defensive line coach. We have rumored to have hired Kevin Patullo. He is our pass game coordinator. He worked as a wide receiver coach and a pass game specialist under Sirianni in Indianapolis from 2018 to 2020. Unsurprising and not something that's uncommon. Sirianni is going out and hiring former people that worked at Indianapolis, and you'll hear some names that he met in the Chargers, but all people that he's worked with in the past. So we got Kevin Patullo. He's our pass game coordinator. I believe we either have hired or it's been strongly rumored that we're going to hire Shane Steichen as our offensive coordinator. He was the offensive coordinator for the Chargers. And with the help of Anthony Lynn, he pushed Justin Herbert to have a very successful rookie year. Justin Herbert is the Chargers quarterback and did pretty well this year in his rookie year. So he had help from Anthony Lynn for that, but was part of the solution. He also worked with Sirianni, this time with the Chargers, from 2014 to 2017, and he was their quarterbacks coach. We hired, or are rumored to be hiring, a new tight ends coach, Jason Michael. Jason Michael was the tight end coach for the Colts for the past 2 seasons. He also worked with Sirianni with the Chargers in 2013. He was for 2 years, for a brief stint, the offensive coordinator for the Tennessee Titans, 2014 and 2015. In 2016, and perhaps I should have looked this up, but in 2016 he was moved to quarterbacks coach. That's a pretty big demotion. I'm not sure if that's because he wasn't successful or if a new coach came in to Tennessee in 2016, but 2 years as an offensive coordinator. He's been in the NFL for 15 years as a coach. He's been with the Raiders, the Jets. We mentioned the Titans, the Chargers we also talked about. He's also been on the 49ers team, been a member of the Arizona Cardinals, and of course the Colts. Now, the one thing that's interesting, I thought anyway, is that he was a tight end coach for the Colts for 2 years, and he's moving over to the Eagles also as a tight end coach, so it's a lateral move. My guess is that he really wants to be part of Sirianni's organization. So we also replaced, I mentioned Press Taylor as one of the coaches that is not coming back, was not asked to come back. And personally, I would like to have fired him myself, which I'm sure there's millions of Eagles fans that are out there would agree. Ryan Reese, what's official? You mentioned that something's official. I don't know if we're talking about the tight end coach, the quarterback coach, Brian Johnson. But Brian Johnson, this will be his first time as a coach in the NFL. The last 3 seasons, he was under Dan Mullen in Florida as a college coach. He was promoted to offensive coordinator in 2020. He was also the offensive coordinator for Houston and Utah. He actually graduated from Utah through college and played football. He was 26-7 as Utah's starting quarterback, and he led them to an undefeated season and a Sugar Bowl championship in 2008. So I am always a huge fan of quarterbacks that turn coach, and admittedly, I would prefer a quarterback who either was successful because of hard work or just wasn't very successful, and it was mostly because they weren't physically talented. And I say that because a quarterback in the NFL has to be smart to succeed. So if you can succeed, and I thought Doug Peterson was right along this line, if you can succeed or stay in the league for a long time as an NFL quarterback, but you don't have the physical gifts like a Mahomes or Lamar Jackson with the way he runs, or even Russell Wilson, if you don't have the physical talents, but you can still hang out in the NFL for 12 or 13 years, or even for a brief moment, or you can take a college team to the championship and lead an undefeated season, you obviously, in my opinion, have the knowledge. And I think that's much more valuable when it comes time to be a coach. So I am a big proponent of former players, specifically former quarterbacks, making the move to coaching. So that's our new quarterback coach. Perhaps that's the official one, Brian Johnson. Some other names that have been thrown around there. Jeff Stoutland. There was some concern that he was going to leave. There were rumors that he was leaving, but from what I understand, the Eagles made that a requirement as part of the hire with Sirianni. So he'll stay. So our offensive line coach Jeff Stoutland should be there, which is, I mentioned before, I think is a good. I'm glad we held on to him, because of all the complaints that everybody said it's our offensive line that was poor. Our offensive line is why Carson Wentz is so bad. Last year they were ranked 17th in the league, which isn't that bad. does not explain away Carson's horrible decline. Our special teams coordinator since 2013, Dave Phipp, he went to Detroit for the same position he had with us, special teams coordinator. And then Deuce Staley. That's a disappointing story from, well, it ended disappointingly in Philadelphia. We talked about Deuce Staley, I don't know if it was the last one or a couple podcasts ago. He has held numerous positions since being an intern with the Eagles in 2009 or 2010. He was the quality control coach. He was the assistant head coach, running backs coach. It seemed as though he was being groomed, and maybe Peterson was, to possibly be an offensive coordinator. I mean, assistant head coach, perhaps. I think he had aspirations of head coaching. He interviewed for the position back when we hired Peterson in 2016, interviewed again for the head coaching position this time. I don't know, to be honest with you, I don't know, without, hearing the interview, I don't know if he's ready to be a full head coach. Perhaps he is. But while I hope that Shane Steichen does very well as our coordinator, offensive coordinator, I don't know that it would have been a bad idea to promote Deuce to offensive coordinator. I think it would have been a good progression in his career. And from what I understand, on top of experience in the organization under Reed, Kelly, and Peterson, he held a lot of respect and everything in the locker room, which is very valuable. Part of, I think, in my opinion, part of the decline of Carson Wentz and our team in general was probably due to locker room issues. I don't have any confirmation, but to me, early on in the season, it seemed like the receivers were sort of giving up on Wentz, disappointed when he threw poor passes. And similarly, there was obviously, there's significant rumors about there being a feud between Wentz and Peterson. And, if you have those kind of things happening in the locker room, when you think about, most people might think, who cares? There's, it's just background noise. But when you consider the fact that we have, in the NFL, you have the best, most elite athletes doing everything they can think of to stay in the best physical shape, the best mental shape, so that they can put in literally over 100% in each play. If there's anything, even something that's distracting you, the lack of fans could even be one. Whatever it is, that little bit of distraction can mean could exactly be what happened to Carson Wentz. That little distraction, the little thing that you're thinking about when you should be reacting in the game, is just enough to make a huge, significant change. So I'm a little disappointed that we didn't find a way to retain Deuce Staley. I'm also disappointed that he left and went to Detroit and has the same position that he had with us. That's even more disappointing, because to me that means that he didn't leave because he wasn't promoted. He left because he felt like there were no more opportunities here, and that's disappointing because I think he did well. So maybe a mistake on the side of the owners and the decision makers. But that was kind of disappointing. So it would be nice to have more insight as to why they let him go, why they weren't willing to promote him. I don't know if they were looking for somebody with more actual experience as an offensive. I'm really not sure. The other part of it could be, and this would make some sense, if you look at some of these recent hires. Jonathan Gannon spent most of his time coaching defensive backs. Tracy Rocker, I don't know what his specialty was, but worked with Gannon, who was specifically with defensive backs. Patullo, the new pass game coordinator, worked with wide receivers, a pass game specialist. Our offensive coordinator was a quarterbacks coach. The tight end coach was also an offensive coordinator who worked with tight ends and quarterbacks. So if you look at the experience of most of our coordinators and even our head coach, there's a very strong lean towards passing. I don't recall through any of my research anyone mentioning about any of the coaches we've hired that they had any experience or were even remotely successful at running the ball. So I think that might have been what I think that's might I think that is what went against Deuce Staley, is that he is a running backs coach, and he was a running back, pretty successful in the NFL, very successful in the NFL in comparison to most. So I think has more of a running back background, and I don't think that that's what they wanted, especially when you consider the two biggest issues with our offense in 2020 and technically since Doug Peterson started, is quarterback with injuries and last year horrible play, and receivers. Um, we've tried to get some good ones with free agency, but haven't really been that successful. And we haven't done a very good job drafting either. So we need help in those two areas, and that seems to have been a focus when you look at the experience of the coaches we've hired. So those are the two guys. Jeff Stoutland staying, Phipps losing. We lost Phipp. I don't know how significant that is. Special teams coaches are important, but I'm sure we can find someone that's good. And then Deuce Staley, again, real disappointing. Okay, so that's the end of current news of all the coaching moves that I thought would be important to talk about. So I'm going to move into, for those of you that maybe didn't listen to some of my earlier podcasts before the season started, I got to find things to talk about, right, to fill the air. And so I included some Eagles facts. So I thought I'd return to that. If you haven't noticed, my podcasts are driven by stats and facts. I throw in some opinions, but generally speaking, I'm going over some stats. So that's kind of my thing. So I thought today I talk about the Eagles, specifically the 1980 Eagles, and I thought I would talk about those because, as I mentioned earlier, there's been two times when a state has had teams in the final games in all four of what are considered the major sports. Those major sports, just in case anybody was wondering, is Major League Baseball, of course, NBA, the NHL, so hockey, and then, of course, the National Football League, the best of them all. So let's take a look at the 1980 season in general closer. Now, I mentioned this was an Eagles podcast, right? But we are going to drift a little bit away from the Eagles, and we're going to talk briefly about the other teams. And I will warn you, I used to watch a decent amount of baseball when I was a kid. Never have watched any meaningful amount of basketball. I've never watched a meaningful amount of hockey. Currently, I watch 0 baseball, 0 basketball, and 0 hockey because I spend so much time watching football when it's on. I enjoy the off season for a little bit of a break. So I just grabbed some information about those teams. So I apologize if I miss. I tried to grab some of the players. I remember actually some of these from when I was a kid, but I apologize if I overlook, as I most likely will, some of the better players on those teams. So I put these in order of my own preference, saving the best for last, beginning with what I would say second place, in my opinion. This is where it becomes opinionated, and maybe you don't agree. So we'll start with the Philadelphia Phillies. Back in 1980, the Philadelphia Phillies got the nickname the Cardiac Kids. That was due to the amount of close games they played. They ended the regular season with 91 wins and 71 losses, which was enough to win the National League East. In the National League Championship Series, the NLCS, they beat the Houston Astros, and that earned them their first National League title since 1950. And they were able to beat the Kansas City Royals at home in Game 6 to win their first World Series in 1980. The opening day lineup had names in it that I remember, like Pete Rose, Mike Schmidt, third baseman. It also had Bake McBride, Gary Maddox, Greg Luzinski, Bob Boone, Larry Boa, Manny Trillo, and I've also heard of Steve Carlton, right? So some pretty big names on the team. So that was the first. That was one of the four who went to the final game in 1980. The second team I'm gonna talk about briefly is the Philadelphia 76ers. They, in the 1980 season, finished with 59 wins and 23 losses. That was their best record since the 1967-68 season. In the Eastern Conference Championship, they were able to beat the Boston Celtics. They beat them 4-1 in that series. Unfortunately, they lost to the LA Lakers in the NBA Finals. They didn't. It wasn't very close. They won. They lost 4-2. And their roster in 1980 included names that I recognize and I knew were popular, like Darryl Dawkins and Julius Erving. So pretty big names there. Then we'll get to the Philadelphia Flyers. I know the least about hockey, and I know the least about hockey players. However, in 1980, the Philadelphia Flyers led the Patrick Division with 48 wins, 12 losses, and 20 ties. In the preliminary round playoffs, they were able to beat the Edmonton Oilers 3-0. And if I remember correctly, Wayne Gretzky was on that Edmonton Oilers team. And from what I also read, the Philadelphia Flyers were actually pretty competitive throughout the 80s, but oftentimes were stifled by Wayne Gretzky. Now, I don't believe he was always on the Oilers. I remember him from when I was a kid, but that's about it from hockey. In the quarterfinals, the Flyers were able to beat the New York Rangers 4-1. They're also a best of series. And then in the semifinals, they were able to beat the Minnesota North Stars. No offense, but that sounds more like a high school team or whatever. But anyway, they beat the Minnesota North Stars 4-1 in the semifinals. However, they lost in Game 6 in overtime to the New York Islanders in the Stanley Cup. Now, Game 6, they lost 4-2, so it wasn't like the whole series was close, but Game 6 was, and it was lost in overtime. I didn't recognize any of the names from the team, and I even tried to Google players from the 1980 team that might have had good careers, and I couldn't really find anything. So that was the Philadelphia Flyers. So last but not least, save the best for last, we have the Philadelphia Eagles. Surprisingly, and if you guys have listened to some of my past podcasts, I talk about Eagles stats and Eagles facts, and I'm going to spend more time specifically on Jaws, because he gets a lot of he's a huge celebrity in Philadelphia. He became an announcer. I think he has a lot of credit for doing well as an NFL quarterback. Now, perhaps, and I'll include in my research, I'll compare him to other NFL quarterbacks back in that time. But if you compare him to current NFL quarterbacks, he wasn't very good. He completed somewhere in the area of 56% of his passes over his career. Most seasons he had double-digit interceptions. So he wasn't as good as his reputation as it precedes him. His reputation is better than what is actually his, was accurate. So anyway, and we'll talk about his stats in a second. So the 1980 Philadelphia Eagles. So some things about them. Head coach was Dick Vermeil. It didn't list an offensive coordinator on the staff, and I believe that's because Vermeil called his own plays. So I don't think we had a specific offensive coordinator. We did have a defensive coordinator, Marion Campbell. I'm not going to go through all of the coordinators or any of that stuff. Back then, we were still playing in Veteran Stadium, the Vet. We shared that. We used to share that with the Philadelphia Phillies. In 1980, we ended the season 12-4. Now, to give you some history on how good we were before the 1980 season, that was the first year that we won our division in 20 years. So we had not won the division that we were in for 20 years past that. So not very good. In addition, something I learned, and you might not be aware, the NFC East as a division was created or founded or whatever in 1967. That was the first time we won the NFC East since its creation in 1967, 13 years earlier. So we ended the season 12-4. Back then, if you were not a wild card, you didn't play. So we skipped the first round and we went straight to the divisional round. We played the Minnesota Vikings in the divisional round, and we won 31-16. Some highlights from that game was Minnesota's quarterback Tommy Kramer threw 5 interceptions in that game. So most like and I didn't actually write down Jaws' stats, but Wilbert Montgomery led the game in rushing, and he only had 26 carries for 74 yards. He had 26 carries for only 74 yards and 2 touchdowns. So Wilbert Montgomery basically won the game for us, and most likely, I'm sure we had some returns for touchdowns. So that brought us up to the NFC Championship. And the best type of NFC Championship is when you play the Dallas Cowgirls and you beat them. And that's exactly what happened in 1980. And that became one of the, for the next, I think, 37 years, that became probably the most famous best Eagles game that we had played, because we had, that was the first and only time that we had won the NFC Championship. But like I mentioned, Ron Jaworski wasn't nearly as good of a quarterback as I had thought he was. Specifically in the game against the Cowgirls, he only completed 9 passes from 29 attempts. He had 91 yards and 2 interceptions. I didn't put that into the. I should, I think his rating was in the 20s. I didn't put that in the calculator to find out what his quarterback rating would have been, but it was awful. 9 completions out of 29 attempts, 91 yards and 2 interceptions. The only reason we won the game is because Wilbert Montgomery ran over everyone. Wilbert Montgomery in that game had 26 rushes for 194 yards and 1 touchdown. So he's the reason we won. Jaws could have lost the game for us. And overall, we rushed for 263 yards and 2 touchdowns on 40 carries in that game. So clearly, either Dallas was a horrible run team, or we just were that dominant in the run game. And looking at that one game, makes me wonder why throughout the season we didn't run more often. When I look at the stats from 1980, Jaworski had over 300 to 400 pass attempts that season, but Montgomery didn't have 1,000 yards. So it was interesting. Now, the 1980, I think, if I remember correctly, I don't think Montgomery was their leading rusher. He might have been injured, but anyway, so that game probably, and I would think, I wasn't old enough to have watched it, but beating the Cowgirls 20-7 in the NFC Championship would have been, at that point and until we won the Super Bowl, the best game that we've ever played. So then we went to the Super Bowl 15, 40 years ago. We lost 27-10. The stats were almost as bad as the score. And Jaws, it was slightly better, but could have easily, a couple of mistakes, and maybe we win. But he was in that game in the Super Bowl against the Oakland Raiders, Super Bowl 15. He was 18 for 31, 291 yards. So they're not horrible. Under 50% completion, which is, over, which is okay. He threw for 1 touchdown, but he also threw 3 interceptions. So, man, it's just not good. Really bad playoff stats for Ron Jaworski. Just bad, really bad. I got to look up his stats against the Vikings. I'm really interested. I don't know if my computer can handle all this multitasking, but I'm going to try and do that while I'm here. Now, in the Super Bowl, they limited Montgomery to only 44 yards on 16 carries. Why he only carried the ball 16 times when the game prior he had 194 yards on 26 rushes, I have no idea. Why we relied on Ron Jaworski to pass the ball 31 times to win? Perhaps maybe we were down early, and so we focused on the pass. I don't know, but not a very good offensive scheme. Now Jim Plunkett for the Oakland Raiders had an excellent game. He completed 13 of his 21 attempts for passes. He had 260 yards, 3 touchdowns, and no interceptions. Okay, so Ron Jaworski in 1980, which was statistically his best game, or his best season. His quarterback rating, I think, was that was by far his best season. He had a 91 quarterback rating. Every year after that, he was in the mid to low 70s. Every year before that, 60s. So in 1980, he had, he threw 27 touchdowns and 12 interceptions. In 1979, 18 touchdowns and 12 interceptions. 1978, the year I was born, 16 touchdowns, 16 interceptions. Even better, in 1977, 18 touchdowns, 21 interceptions. So historically speaking, Jaworski was not a very good quarterback, and I didn't know this. So we'll go into that in more detail in one of the Eagles Facts podcasts, but just some information. Now, on the 1980 Super Bowl losing team, I mentioned some of the real popular names like Ron Jaworski, Wilbert Montgomery, but don't forget about Harold Carmichael. He was one of our best receivers, and Herm Edwards, one of the defensive backs, which, if you guys remember, was the beneficiary of the first Miracle in the Meadowlands. So, all right, that recaps the 1980 Philadelphia sports season and the 1980 loss in the Super Bowl. I hope you guys enjoyed my podcast. As always, please look me up on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, I don't know if there's any other social media companies out there that you're on, but look me up. I'm probably on them. I'm on YouTube. If you search me in YouTube, remember to type in the Bald Eagle Podcast. The more you guys look me up and search me, the more popular I'll get, and most likely I'll show up on some search results. But right now, even if you type in the Bald Eagle, I do not come up. So make sure you type in the Bald Eagle Podcast. And I'm at Bald Eagle 4133 on all social media. And don't forget that I'm part of the Notoriety Sports Network, a growing network of sports channels. I'm part of NSN Philly, which is a subsidiary. So follow Notoriety Sports Network on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and follow NSM Philly on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and keep an eye out for all their shows, podcasts, breaking news, and all that. Everything you would want from a sports network. So thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Go Eagles.